Hello, lovely people. This is Professor Matt, and this is the Too Many Guys Soccer Show. And this is the first of what's going to be a three-part series of sort of longer historical special topics, what have you, based episodes dealing with the intersection of fascism, particularly interwar fascism, and football. Right. And originally, my plan was to get this first episode out in September, but the first part of the semester got away from me. So you're getting it a little later. My hope is, right, because even though midterm exams are coming up in a lot of my sections, I do have a fall break coming up. So ideally, I would like to get episode two, which is going to be dedicated to football in Nazi Germany, out by the end of October. And then the episode on Franco's Spain out sometime, hopefully around Thanksgiving, early December. So bear with me here. Right. This first episode is going to be easily the longest of the three. Right. We're going to talk about football and fascism in the OG laboratory of fascism, which is Italy. So we're going to talk about Mussolini's Italy. And right. But we also have to, and my fellow journeymen, my the two Mikes who did their grad work at Villanova with me, will appreciate this, and everybody, I think, Stead, all the educators on the pod, and all of you guys who are listening, hopefully, are watching. We have to define our terms first. And the reason I say that is fascism is unfortunately one of those looser terms uh, in the world today, right? Everyone, it's like socialism in this country. People use that term constantly, and I'm like, you have no idea what the hell you're talking about. And the same thing applies for fascism, right? It's like everything I don't like is fascism. Everything I don't like is Hitler. And both the right and the left are guilty of this, by the way. I've had to talk to people on the left and be like, look, what you're referring to is bad and it's right wing and it's reactionary and it's anti-democratic, but it might not actually be fascism. Which incidentally, when we talk about Franco's Spain, that's going to be something that comes up because there are some scholars who don't think the Franco regime in Spain represented fascism. And I'm actually on the fence about that. I think early Francoism, like the 30s and the 40s, that probably was fascism. But by the time you get to the 50s and 60s, when Real Madrid are winning all those, trophies, it probably morphs into something closer to like far right, more sort of traditionally conservative, but authoritarian, right? Not totalitarian, uh, right? Because it loses its sort of revolutionary, more about that in a second, or dare I say, kind of utopian aspect. Whereas Italy and Germany, it's slam dunk. So we're going to talk about Italy today. But before we talk about Italy, we got to talk about, what is fascism? And like I said, the left is guilty of misusing this term. The right uses it constantly, and they have no clue what it means. Right, not even close. Uh, Fascism is harder to define than, let's say, something like communism, right? Because there's a communist manifesto, right? There is no fascist manifesto. Fascism, there are many fascist manifestos, and I'll reference a couple uh, in a moment. Fascism emerges out of World War One, but the ideological, the intellectual basis of it emerges much earlier. I think you can take this back all the way to the French Revolution and the Counter Enlightenment. And in many ways, fascism is the Counter Enlightenment for the industrial age, the age of mass culture, the age of mass politics, the age of mass production. Right. But, fascist kind of ideas, proto fascism, existed before World War One, right? You can find it in Italian futurism. You can find it, I'll talk more about this in a couple minutes, in the European experience with imperialism. You can find it in, social Darwinism and eugenics, and, the sort of health movement. And you sort of, pre-war, pre-World War One, 56 on militarism. And you can find it in Friedrich Nietzsche too, despite what crazy hippies tell you. Friedrich Nietzsche is not a left-wing philosopher. You cannot possibly read him in any kind of left-wing fashion. I refuse to entertain that conversation. Nietzsche hated democracy, he hated women, he hated socialism, he hated poor people. Was he a fascist? Probably not, but he was pretty goddamn close. Right. So fascism emerges from all of these things emanating, again, beginning with the Counter Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the 18th and the early 19th centuries, and then crystallizes during World War One. World War One is the catalyst that sort of brings all these things together. So if there's no fascist manifesto per se, what can we get a working definition of fascism? Well, that's what I'm here to do today. I'm going to provide one. And again, shout out to Villanova and their Masters in History program, and shout out to my buddy Andrew P. motherfucking Miller, my former roommate, my comrade, my one of the groomsmen in my wedding, for giving me the best little shorthand definition of fascism I ever heard. We were doing a study session for comprehensive exams, and he encapsulated fascism, I think, perfectly. And right, because fascism is an ideology of the right, but it's different from traditional conservatism. Traditional conservatism, be it Christian democracy in Western Europe, be it the Republican Party at the least up until like John McCain in this country, uh, stand for traditional values. They're afraid of change. They want to preserve traditional hierarchies. Right in the Anglo-Saxon world, so in Britain, the United States, and Australia, they have giant boners for free market capitalism. In Western Europe, they really don't, because a lot of this conservatism is coming from Catholicism. And newsflash, guys, if you're Catholic, you have to hate capitalism. The Pope said so like 150 years ago. Check it. He also said hate socialism either. So maybe that's why in Catholic countries like Spain and Italy, there's like a vacuum that opens for things like fascism. But right, fascism isn't traditional conservatism. It's not. Uh, Fascism is a revolutionary movement. More about that in a second. But fascism at its essence is what Andy said many moons ago: reactionary futurism. That seems strange. It seems paradoxical. Embrace the paradoxes. So fascism is a right wing. It's a reactionary political ideology. It looks backward and pines for a world before industrial modernity effed the world up. But it's futurist because fascism, even though it rejects aspects of industrial modernity, embraces industrial modernity. Uh, Fascism purports to create a society where you have all the benefits of the industrial age: mass culture, mass media, mass politics, urbanization, you know, mass spectacle, so sport, etc. But without what it would see as the deficiencies, the decadence, right, the sickness of modernity. And what do they see as the sickness? Well, they see things like class struggle, socialism, feminism, immigrants, right? Because immigration and industrial capitalism go together like bacon and eggs. Uh, Urbanization to a point, right? City's good, but too much city is bad. And indeed, too much civilization bad. Because this is the paradox. Fascism purports to uphold their notion of Western European white civilization. But they're also terrified of too much civilization, because too much civilization will turn strong, healthy, pure racial bodies into soft, socialist, homosexual, effeminate, right, useless pansy bodies. And so fascism, on the one hand, it's pining for mythic pasts. Right, the Roman Empire, far dark forests with Teutonic knights. Uh, I guess if you're Vladimir Putin, fucking Rus. If you're a Zionist, the biblical kingdom of Israel that hasn't existed in over 2,000 years. Right, that's what you're aiming to create. But this is the revolutionary part of it. You're aiming to recreate that by using all of the tools of industrial modernity. You're going to use industrial modernity to create a backward looking or sort of, this mythic past. But this mythic past coexists with all the goodies of the industrial era. You're going to use modernity to combat the so-called sicknesses or illnesses of modernity, right? And so fascism is also it's the revolutionary far right. Right. And right, so there really isn't a fascist manifesto. The closest is actually a document that's written by Mussolini himself that appears in 1932. And I use this in my classes constantly. My Global Twos, my World War II. I even teach a class now strictly on interwar fascism, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this goddamn series, because I want to find an excuse to, put more sport and particularly football related material into those courts, into that course. Right, it's this document where he defines, what is it's simply called "What is Fascism?" And "What is Fascism" starts first sentence with "Fascism is action." And that's important because that goes right back to the counter Enlightenment. The Enlightenment preached understanding the world through reason and logic. You know, the Enlightenment is all about rationality. And, we're talking about the Enlightenment, we're talking about, liberalism, right? But we're also talking about socialism as well, and particularly Marxist socialism. And we usually don't think about Marx as an Enlightenment thinker. But remember, he thought his socialism was scientific and that socialism needed to be understood through the lens of reason and logic and science and inquiry. Liberalism and socialism speak to this, your brain. Fascism doesn't give a fuck about your brain. Fascism is all about emotion, all about feelings, all about the irrational versus the rational. Indeed, the irrational, the spontaneous is celebrated, which I guess goes back to proto fascism's, syndicalism, which is technically an ideology of the left. A lot of former syndicalists, including Mussolini, become fascists because syndicalism rejects the sort of scientific basis of Homeboy behind me. And it's all like the general strike and this mythic moment, and it's all about spontaneity. And fuck the contradiction. Don't worry about the contradictions, man. Uh, that bleeds over into fascism, this embrace of the irrational, which, if you think about it, makes sense why a lot of young people and a lot of certain intellectuals, particularly certain artists in the interwar period, gravitate towards fascism, right? Because fascism fascism is all about the soul. Fascism is all about the about emotion. Fascism is all about the irrational. Speaking of artists, Hitler was an artist. He's a shitty artist, but he's an artist. More about him next week, or not next week, next episode. Right. So fascism is action, whereas liberalism and socialism are contemplation. Right. And again, this goes right back to the counter Enlightenment, this rejection of, the Enlightenment world. Beyond fascism is action. Fascism and action also too is in constant motion. Hmm. Machines, maybe industrialization, sport, right? The body and the body of the nation as a machine is right. Fascism sees the nation as kind of a machine, right? That's constantly in motion, constantly in action. But what else? What else is fascism about? Well, it's ultra nationalist. And what I mean by ultra nationalism in this context is explicitly ethno nationalism. not civic nationalism, not the weird kind of Soviet patriotism that the Soviet Union under Stalin kind of fostered. I'm talking about, racially, biologically in many cases, but not necessarily, but racially, ethnically understood nationalism. And right, this means, you know, and Italy for quote unquote Italians, a Germany for quote unquote Germans. And right, again, going back to this notion about the nationalism, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're anti-Semitic. Right, there's a lot of crazy things being thrown out there now because of events in the Middle East. Uh, the Nazis were certainly anti-Semitic. Some fascists were anti-Semitic. The German brand was. A lot of the brands in places like Central and Eastern Europe, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, etc., Ukraine, certainly were anti-Semitic. But Italian fascism wasn't anti-Semitic until it met German fascism in the late 30s and sort of altered things. A lot of the big fascist leaders in places like Florence and Milan were actually Jewish. They're middle class Jews. And right, I don't want to go there, but I am going to go there. If you think about Zionism and what it purports about, Jew identifying Judaism through a racial lens, explicitly racial lens, and the notion that Jews have somehow lost something and they have to get back to the good mythic strong Jewish race, and that they have a special homeland, which is theirs because blood and soil much. Yeah, that sounds an awful lot like fascism too. In fact, most of the fascists I've met in this world, a good chunk of them, are the biggest supporters of the state of Israel. Not necessarily Jews per se, but other fascists that see an ethno state and say, "Hey, I recognize that. That's cool. I wish we did that in this country." White power. So ethno-nationalism, imperialism. Imperialism and fascism go together like bacon and eggs. And I talked about how imperialism kind of set up fascism. I would argue, and I'm not the first person to do this, that fascism is imperialism come home. That if you look at what fascism is, this notion of defining race and defining nationality, defining nationality through the lens of race, and all of these genocidal, militaristic, anti-democratic solutions. And right, if you think about all those things were tested in the colonies on Africans, on Native Americans, on Arabs, on the Chinese, on Indians, etc. And then with World War One, all of this stuff came home. And so fascism you can think of as, imperialism come home. And fascism sort of needs imperialism to fulfill its ideological mission of creating a, pure, race and a strong, healthy nation. Because for fascists, having an empire, be it in the Italian context in Africa, like Ethiopia and Libya, or in the German context, in the places where your professor's family's from, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, etc. Uh, Fascism and imperialism are tied together at the hip. Patri Fat, and I speak properly. Fascism is also incredibly patriarchal. There's a lot of toxic masculinity going on here, and we'll talk about this too, right, in regards to sport and regards to like the Mussolini himself and the way he portrayed himself. Right. It's hierarchical, but this is different, and this is one of the key differences between fascism and like conservatism. Conservatives believe in a hierarchical society and people should know their place. But a lot of that comes from traditional sort of European noble or aristocratic worldviews. Uh, or I guess in the case of the United States, this harking back to, an America before steam engines made these very people very rich, but also made a lot more people really poor and alienated and pissed off. Right. So, but fascism, its hierarchy is different. It's an aristocracy, but it's an aristocracy of the masses. Anyone, as long as you are part of the chosen group, the pure race, the master race, can become a fascist aristocrat and rise through society. And the way you rise through society is might makes right. Right. Fascism's also about social Darwinism, and they believe that the strongest and the fittest survive, and they rule and conquer, and in some cases just slaughter the impure, the weak, the unhealthy. So for fascism, it's hierarchical. And right, at the top is the fascist leader, the Fuhrer, the Duce, the Jefe, uh, etc., who is the embodiment. He was the Superman of Superman. More about that when we talk about Mussolini in a second. But the way you get there is through physical prowess and through racial health, right, and virility. And again, this is going back to the Western civilization good, too much civilization bad. You need to be, savage. You need to be brutal. And, Mussolini referred to this new aristocracy as a trenchocracy, right? Because him and those first wave of fascist cadres are all veterans of World War One. And Mussolini was like, this is the coolest, war is the coolest thing since sliced bread because war made us stronger, war made us harder. We're hard men, and therefore we, being hard men, being Italian, being the heirs to the Roman Empire, being part of this master race, we obviously should be at the forefront. We should be leading this thing, and everyone else just like listens to us because they're a weak peon. They're weaklings, right? Uh, I mentioned war and World War One is so important in understanding all of this because it's when fascism becomes fascism. Uh, for fascists, war as well as imperialism, which I guess go together because if you're going to do imperialism, you got to do war. Uh, War is essential to fulfill the fascist project because war is not destructive. War is healthy. War is creative. Violence in fascism is redemptive. It's cleansing. It destroys the weak, the sick, the decadent, and raises up the strong. In fact, it strengthens the strong and it makes them purer and healthier. So, war, and Mussolini even said this every good nation should go to war every 30 years to regenerate, regeneration, uh, the race, right? So that we continue to be tough and strong and have our virility intact. So if you think about it in that regard, fascism, it's a ideology of the right, but it doesn't look like, I don't know, the George Bush II Republican Party. Like, I don't know, I think they did bad shit, but I don't think they were fascists. And that's because there's this really revolutionary, dare I say, utopian aspect to fascism. Fascism wants to create a mythic past which hasn't existed and probably in some ways never really existed the way they conceive it in the present using all of the tools of industrial modernity and to, in a very real way, create a new kind of human being, a new man, the perfect Aryan subject, the new Roman that will, rule over the new Roman Empire. And that's different because traditional conservatives hate utopian ideas. They don't want you to dream big, right? If anything, they're all about, nah, you're a small man, know your place, right? Eat it, poor guy. Right. Fascists, and again, maybe this is why fascism it arose out of mass politics. It understood mass politics way better than liberalism certainly did. Fascism's all about utopia. Fascism's all about dreaming big. Now, their dreams are most people's nightmares, but it's this we're going to create a better world and a new kind of person. The problem, of course, is this new better world is this, ethno state built upon genocide and, etc. So how does sport play into this? Well, sport plays into this in a lot of ways. Because if you think about sport, and again, mass sport begins also in the industrial era. It's all about health, it's all about strength, it's all about physicality. Right. Particularly when sport becomes internationalized with the Olympics, it becomes about national pride, and fascism's all about national pride. And it's about spectacle. It's about stadiums and people losing their mind and being irrational in stadiums. Fascists love full stadiums, the masses, and they love loud, crazy, frenzied stadiums. So sport and fascism make sense. There's a connection. And indeed, the Fascist Party of Italy convenes in the late 20s, about 5 years after they seized power, a national congress about sport and the promotion of sport. And by the way, in this particular episode, I'm going to be drawing heavily from the works of Christopher Dugan and Simon Martin, who wrote a great book called Football and Fascism. And so, their work is excellent. I would highly recommend you guys going to check that out. So consider this your footnotes, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, and at this Congress, there was a resolution passed. And I think this resolution says a lot about fascism. Uh, this is the resolution of that Congress. The National Fascist Party in pursuing effective sporting propaganda. That's key. I've been saying this from time. It's never just a game. For fascists, it is never just a game. It is always politics. It is always ideological. It's always political. In pursuing effective sporting propaganda, which started with the intent of decisively and energetically caring for the physical education of our youth. Again, fascists are social Darwinists. If Marxists believe history is class struggle, fascists say history is race war. So you have to get the youth physically educated and physically fit so that they can go and be cannon fodder in the next inevitable war that you're going to fight to purify the race and to expand your empire. Right. The physical education of the youth decided to build sports grounds in every commune in Italy. Mass politics. Sport is seen as something inherently political. It's seen as something necessary for this fascist regeneration or rejuvenation of the new Italian. And it's going to be accessible. It's for the masses. It's for everybody. Workers, peasants, northerners, southerners, etc. And it must respond to the modern need of the sport to be easy and inexpensive to produce, which goes back to fascism wants to create the new Roman. And they're going to create the new Roman by building sports pitches, athletic stadiums, fields. But you're going to do that by using industrial, modern architectural and engineering practices. You're going back to the Roman Empire, but you're using all of the goodies of the Industrial Revolution to do that. And that's not seen as a contradiction, right? And stadiums. If you think about, fascism and you think about, again, sort of irrationality and this, notion that it's the masses and it's under fascism, there's no such thing as Napolitanos, there's no such thing as Sicilians, there's no such thing as people from Lombardy, there's just Italians. And there's no such thing as workers, there's no such thing as bourgeois, there's no such thing as peasants, just Italians. That's fascism's answer to socialism. That no, 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 no. It's not about dividing a society along, you know, social economic lines. It's about uniting a society and a race as one. This notion of racial unity And right, in the Italian context, more about that in a second, overcoming very real regional right disunity. So stadiums are this great public arena spectacle, mass spectacle, where this can kind of play itself out, political theater, if you will. And so, right, this is Giovanni di Infante, who actually was, Mussolini's sports minister. They had a whole ministry of sport uh, on stadiums and why they're important. A modern stadium needs to be made for the everyday, not for the various privileged classes of spectators. So for the masses, for ordinary people. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about, the fascist reforms of football in the 30s and, building new stadiums and creating a new club, which again, if you know football and you know contemporary Italian football rivalries, is going to sound weird, but we'll get there. Uh, you know, not for the privileged classes of spectators. And already the Romans, with their highest amphitheaters, had also reached to the objective to offer everybody seats at practically the same level of visibility. So you want to build stadiums that you want to pack everybody in, all these different socioeconomic classes, etc., with equal sort of visibility. No differently, we need to aim to make our modern and not only uh, ours modern and not only for positive social aesthetics. Again, this notion of the sport is not going to be segregated by class, etc. Reasons, but also for obvious reasons of practical economy. The motto has to be we do not spend even a penny. We do not waste a bit of steel or a sack of cement to make those seats that the public do not love. And again, this notion of you're going to use sport to fulfill this political aim, which is again sort of backward looking. But you're going to use modern, efficient, industrial modes and means to get there. Again, reactionary futurism. So sport in the context of fascist Italy and indeed fascism in general is incredibly important, right? It speaks to national pride, it speaks to health, physicality, strength, and right, the sort of mass spectacle. And again, maybe this kind of social, again, especially in the Italian case, regional leveling, this attempt to transform Sicilians, Napolitanos, workers, peasants, bourgeois into Italians, real Italians. And right, there's kind of, the lead comes from the top because Mussolini, as the leader of fascism, as the leader of the nation, as the Superman of a race of Superman, he has to be the ultimate sportsman, right? And indeed, if you look at the iconography of Italian fascism and the Duce, it's funny. Freaking Putin does the same stupid thing, and right? Because this all comes back to like fascism's inherent toxic masculinity. There's all these like photos and posters of Mussolini with no goddamn shirt on, which is weird because dude was built not totally unlike me. I mean, I drink more beer. I'm not as physically active, so I'm more of a beer gut. But he was like 5'5" nothing, and kind of like barrel chested. But there's all these like propaganda posters of him with no shirt on, playing tennis, skiing, right, swimming, cycling. And so Mussolini is portrayed as the ultimate sportsman, this larger than life Italian who is an exemplar of the Italian race, who is physically fit and is robust. And he's a modern man, but he has his savagery, his innate, is kind of intact. And indeed, right? The Duce was portrayed as a Superman who was virile, athletic, the ultimate sportsman in what's going to be an entire race of, virile, athletic, great sports. And again, there's all these films and photographs and posters showing this, bare-chested dude, even again, skiing up in the Alps where it's fucking cold. Why would you not have a shirt on, you dickhead? Right? Uh, the the journalist Adolfo Coramente, who is the deputy director of the sporting newspaper, not only did fascism control the media, they even had their own like version of the sporting news. So you had fascist sporting news, right? La Gazzetta della Sport, which literally means the Gazette of Sport. Uh, described Mussolini as, whoa, a man of sport in the highest sense, because his physical life and moral life harmonize and they complement each other wonderfully. His torso is powerful, his arm athletic. He seems made to break and to crush. Again, the fascist notion of strength, virility, might makes right. So you're strong, but you use your strength to crush your Conan the Barbarian is like the Schwarzenegger one, not the piece of shit. There's a really fascist aesthetic about that movie. And if you want to sum up like the fascist ethos, remember the scene in Conan. Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of the women. That's fascism 101. You use your physical strength to break shit, to hear the lamentations of the women. Right? Uh, he seems made to break and crush. In the face of this exuberance of muscles and nerves, in the face of that Herculean solidarity. So they're comparing Mussolini to Hercules. Uh, our imagination stops. We feel that no one can beat him, that no one can compete with him, a giant among pygmies. And indeed, that's what fascism attempted. That's what the fascist new man was going to be. It was going to be this Hercules, this giant among pygmies, the new Italian race, the, pure heirs of the Roman Empire. And sport was going to do that because sport is the way that you can craft, this new kind of Italian. But notice the kind of sports that Mussolini is playing: tennis, swimming, skiing, cycling, etc. They're all kind of individualistic sports, and which makes sense because fascism is all about hierarchies and the individual, but the individual, like, being this, like, you're part of a mass, but you also individually, you know, uh, have to like conquer all these things. Notice football is totally absent, which is weird because by the time Mussolini comes to power, as early as the 1920s, football, which was introduced into Italy in the 1880s and the 1890s, is already the most popular goddamn sport in the country. Football, soccer, they call it calico, right? Why is football not there? And indeed, why in early on in the 20s did Mussolini refer to football as that insignificant game? Football's a hot potato for fascists. Football, in a lot of ways, sort of fulfills aspects of the fascist mission, stadiums, the irrational. Believe me, my neighbors know when Liverpool has scored a big goal because I lose my freaking mind. I go from being hyper rational to a lunatic person like this. Action. Right? And right, when the game's internationalized, there's all national pride in there. It's physical, it's about strength and, all these things. But in so many ways, football is everything that fascism hates. Football is urban and it emerges out of urban areas and particularly poorer urban areas during the Industrial Revolution. It is a game that emerges out of the very decadence that fascism wants to combat. It is working class, explicitly working class, and it's not particularly hierarchical. Anybody, unless of course you live in the United States when we have pay to play youth soccer, and it's a white boy suburban sport. Uh, you know, Football is for the ordinary people. It's not for the elites, and so it's not just working class. It's not just urban. It's kind of inherently democratic, right? Which fascism despises. Uh, it's about the collective versus the individual. Like fascism, for all that talks about masses, it's also the embodied. It's all embodied in the leader and the Superman and the individual. Football defies that. You can't have 11 Supermen on a pitch. Real Madrid tried that back in the day. It didn't really work out so well. This is why the English national team for most of my lifetime sucked because you had 11 really talented guys, but they weren't playing as a collective. So, if you think about the values of football and what makes effective football, it's collectivism, not individualism. Right. And that I think is really important because if you look at football's relationship to the other form of totalitarianism at the time, Stalinism, Stalinism embraces football as part of the Soviet modernizing project. Maybe we'll talk more about that in some episodes after the new year, right on the other side of the new year. But like the Soviets embrace football to the point that they're having prisoners in the gulag play football because they think that would make you a better Soviet person. Why? Because of this collectivist nature. There's also, right, with football, a tendency, right, because fascism wants to turn everybody into Italians. It strives for racial national unity and, the obliteration or the submersion of class differences, regional differences, etc. If you know anything about football, it is all about differences. The club that you root for says everything it needs to know about your socioeconomic class, where you're from, etc. And in case of Italy, I mean these regional and these social and economic cleavages are out there in the open. Every big city in Italy has a working class team and a bourgeois team, right? In Milan, it's AC Milan's the working class team and Inter's the bourgeois team. In Rome, well, now it's Lazio and Roma, right? So there's socioeconomic cleavages that are played out, on the pitch and in the terraces. So exactly what fascism doesn't want. Football doesn't necessarily create unity and harmony. It actually demonstrates the real socioeconomic differences in a country. Ditto regionalism, right? Why do Napoli fans loathe and despise all of the teams north of Rome? Because Northern Italy and Southern Italy, in many ways, are still two very different countries. And if you don't believe me, read my homeboy Antonio Gramsci on the subject. Right? Italy unifies in the 19th century, but in so many, unique ways, Italy is not a unified country. It's one of the reasons, actually, and Coach G will hate me for this, why I can never get warm and fuzzy about the Italian national team because my family is from Naples and they considered themselves more Neapolitan than they did Italian because you know, as far as they were concerned, everyone north of Rome thought you were like a subhuman piece of filth. And right, that is built into the identity of Napoli Football Club, right? If you go further south, you go to Sicily, it's even starker, right? Uh, so there's the north and south divide, uh, right? So in a lot of ways, football's a hot potato. In some ways, it's a wonderful vehicle for the new fascist regime that comes to power in the early 20s to, birth its ideological vision of what a new Italy and a new Italian is going to look like. But in a lot of ways, just by being football, it represents the antithesis of all that fascism stands for. And so the fascist regime has to tread lightly with football because they're aware of this. And again, Mussolini early on is like, football's that insignificant game. Oh, and there's another reason. It's not really authentically Italian, it's English. And so, fascism is all about the authentic, the national, whatever the hell that even freaking means. How can the most popular game in your country be a British import? Right? Because it's not authentically Italian. It's funny, the Soviets did not have a problem like this. The Soviets were like, yeah, the game is English because working class game, collective notions, people coming together, working together, you know, uh, if it's English, fuck it. Like they had no problem with that. This gives the Italians, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about Germany, agita, because it's not a quote unquote Italian game. It's not a German game. It's English and a Scottish game. So it's an importance in a regime that privileges ethno national authenticity. So football is a double-edged sword because if fascism wants to turn workers, peasants, Sicilians, Napolitanos into Italians, football in many ways doesn't actually create this unity. It actually exposes all of these differences. And it represents so many things at its core that fact is the absolute antithesis to fascism. So fascism's embrace of football, because eventually the regime does embrace football, the game, is paradoxical. There's always this paradox. Because, right, it is a vehicle to promote national pride, and we'll talk about the Italian national team in this period before we leave. It's a form of mass spectacle, right? It's a vehicle for physical fitness and health and virility, but it also, in so many ways, represents everything fascism hates. So the fascists have to tread carefully. But by the late 20s, fascism comes to, if not, it never loves football, but it comes to embrace it as a modes and means and as a tool for the fascist, project of reinvigorating and recreating the new Italian. And so in 1929, the state really begins to intervene in not just sport, but football in particular. And so before the late 20s, the way that you got crowned an Italian championship, the champion was a clusterfuck. Uh, right, there wasn't any, one professional, excuse me, uh, you know, top league. There were a series of regional leagues, and then the winners of those regional leagues would play in some stupid, weird playoff thing, and that's how you would get your champion. And right there, like, wasn't really promotion relegation. It was a mess. It's fascism that modernizes the Italian game, and it's funny because again, one of the reasons they're comfortable with it's because it's British. Well, they modernized it along British lines. In 1929, uh, the Italian league pyramid is, standardized, and you get Serie A and Serie B. These are creations of fascism, right? To make the Italian game and put it in line with the British game, and really most of the rest of the world at that, or at least most of the rest of Europe at that time, they had already moved to this kind of system, the system that we all know and love. Right. So they modernize, Italian football. They start building stadiums, uh, giant stadiums. And these stadiums are like dual purpose. They're where you can have the big rally, where you can listen to Mussolini rant and rave about how you're the master race, the heirs to the Roman Empire, and Albanians shouldn't exist because Albania belongs to Italy, and all these things. But where you could also watch Napoli or Inter Milan or AC Milan or Fiorentina on a Saturday and Sunday afternoon, right? After you got home from your job, which you couldn't strike at or negotiate with your boss because labor unions are illegal, right? And so part of it's like also kind of, I guess you'd say, bread and circus as well. But again, fascism loves spectacle. They believe, and they love the mass, this notion of the masses. And these stadiums are built because the older Italian stadiums, they're segregated. They're segregated on our own class lines. These stadiums are for everybody. This is mass sport, modern sport at its finest. And again, this notion that fascism wants to destroy these divisions and create a new Italian whole. They also start messing around with individual clubs. The one I know, this one's been brought up either on the pod or definitely in the chat. It's weird, Inter Milan has this reputation of being an, anti-fascist club, and the way they are, although they are the upper class club in Milan. Most of the people that vote for Inter probably voted for the successors of Mussolini's party in the last election. They're not Fascist Bozo FC. More about them in a second. Uh, but it's AC Milan that traditionally is the working class, the anti-fascist club in the city, the club that has connections to the Italian Communist Party, etc. The big unions. Silvio Berlusconi fucked that all up in the 80s, but Berlusconi fucked up everything. Inter, the club's name is Internazionale Milan. Again, even though the people that root for Inter are part of fascism's, you know, base, the fact that they were called Internazionale like was too much. And the fascist sport ministry said, no, you cannot have that name because A, you're an Italian club, and B, it sounds too much like the Communist International. So you have to screw Inter. You're going to be called Association Sportiva Ambrosina. And yeah, for like 11, 12 years, actually, probably about 15 years when all said and done, Inter Milan had this goofy ass name that no one ever really took to, right? Because, the brand of Inter had, predated fascism and people knew about it. But yeah, Inter gets this weird name change because Internazionale isn't Italian enough and it sounds like communism. It sounds like the Moscow conspiracy, right? For Mussolini and for fascism, Rome is the center of the world. It's the capital of the country. It's also the mythical capital, right? Again, this notion that we are the new Roman Empire. Uh, Rome had several clubs, including that club that we call on this podcast Fascist Bozo FC, because you don't call them by their names. You call them by their name, you give them power. Fuck them. They didn't really have a mass club. In fact, if anything, Rome's clubs were divided into neighborhoods, which were divided by socioeconomic divisions. Fascism wants to, create unity from this. So what the hell did the fascist regime do? Well, they merged a bunch of clubs, particularly working class clubs in Rome, together to form a brand new club called AS Roma. And AS Roma, in the mind of the fascist sports ministry, was going to be a fascist showpiece club. This club was going to become the best club in Italy and the best club in their minds eventually in Europe. And indeed, it's weird. If you look at AS Roma's iconography, yeah, you got Romulus and Remus, and that's Roman, but if you think about again this notion of this is Roman Empire region, the iconography is actually is in some ways more than Nazi, more than fascist Bozo FC, weirdly kind of fascist adjacent. But see, this is the great irony of this project and why the fascist project in terms of football kind of ultimately fails. It doesn't get rid of these regional differences. Napoli fans still hate everyone to the north because their identity is more Neapolitan than it is Italian. Again, sorry, Coach Hugh, that's why I can't get behind the Azzurri that much because I look at these guys and I'm like, they're from Genoa, they're from Turin, they're not from where my family's from. It's right, and it doesn't really break these class identifications either. Because here's the great irony and the great, you know, failure. This is the failure, and it's hysterical, really, of the fascist project in regards to AC Roma. AC Roma is arguably one of the most anti-fascist fan bases in Italian football, and they become the great rivals of that upper class club based out of the part of Rome called Lazio, which we call fascist Bozo FC, right? The people that root for Roma, even in the fascist period, are workers who never really take all that well to fascism because, unlike in Germany, where the left, even though the left is illegal in Italy, it's not decapitated. It's not the same level of oppression. A lot of ordinary Italian workers, even though you couldn't be socialist or communist, or you could only join the fascist labor union, which wasn't a labor union at all, they still had the memories and they still had their own, class identifications, and they never really took to fascism. And so this fascist showpiece club winds up actually being like the least fascist club ever. So domestically, fascism's legacy and fascism's, success, I guess, is a mixed bag. The fascist regime does modernize Italian football. Italian football, as we know it today, is effectively a fascist adventure. But in terms of breaking down these regional and these socioeconomic identities and creating Italians, it's kind of an epic failure. It doesn't achieve really much of anything. Right. And again, the irony, the paradox of AC Roma, which is set up deliberately as a fascist showpiece club, and the fact that its fan base is like anti-fascist as hell, is I think a testament. Fascism, however, is more successful engaging with football in the international arena. International football is about national pride, not necessarily in the fascist way, right? Because I think all of us in this podcast, in some way, I become super Polish during international tournaments. It's about national pride, and the pitch is kind of a battlefield. It's a battlefield of ideas, a battlefield of systems, battlefield of ideologies. Indeed, the battlefield of the pitch is akin to that thing that fascism loves and needs: war. Football and international football is war. When Italy plays fill in the blank, it is war, and Italy needs to win because Italy is the greatest country on the face of God, and the Italian race is the purest master race. And so, victory, we need victory. Fascism is in power already for almost 10 years when the first World Cup is held in Uruguay. Italy, like a bunch of European countries, only a handful of European countries show up to the first World Cup. And a lot of the reason is it's expensive. The Italians could afford it, but they didn't go because they didn't want to lose. And they didn't want to lose to the host nation, which was the likely favorite. Mussolini didn't want to risk sending a team to Uruguay because Italy had already lost the semifinal of the Olympics in 1928 in Amsterdam to the host nation, to the Uruguayans. And for Mussolini, he didn't want to humiliate, he didn't want to have Italy humiliated again. And humiliated too, because if you look at those Uruguayan teams at the 20s and the early 30s, they ain't white, man. There's the like unlike Argentina, or at least unlike what Enzo Fernandez thinks about Argentina. There are a lot of black guys, there are a lot of people of color on those early Uruguayan teams. And to lose to Uruguay is bad enough. To lose to a Uruguayan team that has a black face, that's fascism couldn't allow that. But Mussolini does get a chance because in 1934, Italy hosts the Second World Cup. They outbid Sweden, right? Mainly because this World Cup is being held during the Depression, and the Swedish government, because they have some fucking sense, is like, we shouldn't host a major international soccer tournament because we have mad unemployed people. And this is not just going to be a drain on the economy. Fascism doesn't give a shit about the Great Depression. They're like, no, we need this, and we need to turn this World Cup into the fascist World Cup. This has to be a spectacle for not just, Italy, but the fascist product and fascist ideology. This is going to be our showpiece. So think of this as kind of the 1936 Berlin Olympics that were the Nazi Olympics. So, this is going to be our World Cup, and this is going to be the fascist World Cup. This is going to be explicitly politicized. Uh, we're going to use the World Cup to show the world who we are, and we're going to show the us what we are capable of, and the fact that we're going to confirm to the Italian people who are suffering from the Great Depression, mind you, that we are in fact a great nation and a great people and a great race. This World Cup is in some ways actually the first modern World Cup. It's sort of an over the top tournament. The first World Cup in Uruguay took place literally in one city, Montevideo, and that was it. Couple stadiums, one city. The 1934 version is going to be played in 8 different locations: Rome, Milan, Bologna, Turin, Trieste, Genoa, Naples, and Florence. Uh, there's going to be 3 brand new venues: the Stadio di Nazionale in Rome, which is going to house Roma, which is this special fascist club for the capital of fascism, right? And the Litorale in Bologna, and the San Siro. This is where we get the San Siro, guys. The San Siro is built explicitly by fascist Italy for the 34 World Cup. Now, again, this is more than just a tournament. This is more than just a game. This is politics. And indeed, before the championship, Mussolini was very clear to the Italian coaching staff and to the Italian team and to his sports ministry. We must conquer the championship. This is Mussolini. The Italian head coach, a guy by the name of Vittorio Pozzo, responds, we'll do our best. Mussolini, you don't understand me. Italy must win. This is an order. So the head coach of the national team meets with the dictator guy. I don't know, and they had like pasta, coffee, what have you. And literally, it's like, you must win. All right, we'll do what we can. It's like, no, you don't understand. This is a fucking order. You will win. And indeed, the way that the tournament is being built up is put in explicitly fascist and explicitly racialized terms. The chief journalist of Italy's biggest sports newspaper, we already talked about this, La Gazzetta dello Sport, wrote an article in which he explicitly said, behind the athletic victory shines the victory of the race. So if Italy is the master, if Italians are the master race, then Italy has to win the World Cup. There's no other way around that. And the Italian team that enters that tournament is a pretty good team. Vittorio Pozzo had worked his way up through the Italian league system, had won a couple Italian league titles, good head coach. Uh, Italy wasn't the captain yet, he's captain in 38. Arguably one of the best players in world football at the time, and one of football's first genuine superstars in Giuseppe Meazza, who played for Inter, now at that time going under a weird name, and a bunch of Argentine dudes whose, you know, parents had immigrated to Argentina from Italy and then got Italian passports, the so-called repatriated ones. So the Italian team in 34 doesn't just have, a pretty good Italian base. I think there's seven of these, Argentine Italian guys who get Italian passports. So again, this in some ways is a very modern tournament because we have these discussions about how can Declan Rice play for England, blah 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 blah, or how is the best Brazilian right back at the 2018 World Cup playing for Russia? Mussolini was doing this shit in the 30s, guys. He was handing out Italian passports and he was like, it's okay, you guys are Italian, you're the repatriated at that. It's a good team, but they're not necessarily the favorites. Austria, more about these guys when we talk about Germany in the next episode. They have a incredibly talented team. The Czech team that the Italians play in the final are really young but really talented. Uh, Hungary, excuse me, has a really good team. I'm gonna close these blinds and see if the light is bad in here at the moment. Right. So and Spain. So the Italian regime, Mussolini regime, they have to. I think I figured it out. They have to kind of make certain that victory is secured because this victory is an ideological victory, and no is not an answer. So there are bribes paid. There are probably bribes also to get the tournament in Italy in the first place. But again, Sweden dropped out because they don't have the goddamn money. And the choice of refs are very interesting. The Italian FA and the organization committee and Mussolini himself personally chose referees. And these refs would then get wined and dined by Italian officials, by in some cases Mussolini himself. And let's say conversations were had. So Italy plays Spain in the quarterfinal, and this Spanish team is really good. And this is one of those ideologically heated matches, in so much that this is Republican Spain. And the Spanish Civil War is still 2 years away, but Republican Spain was kind of hella left wing. And then you have Mussolini's Italy, which, Italy won that match, but Italy won by, let's say, not very suspicious circumstances. The first, it's actually two-legged, right? The first match ends in a draw. And then the replay, the Italians win 1-0. But all the calls seem to go Italy's way. And indeed, these refs wind up getting suspended by UEFA after this tournament. So the refs that did that second Italy Spain match, that they don't have work. They can't manage. They can't ref. Excuse me. They can't ref international matches after matches after that match. Same kind of deal in the semifinal when Italy plays Austria. And again, they triumph 1-0. So you had a weird penalty. And then the Italians beat the Czechs in the final 2-1 in a match which, again, things probably weren't on the level. But I'll say this, they probably won actually on merit. And right, Italy wins the World Cup. The ideological, superiority of Italian football, the Italian nation, the Italian race is demonstrated. They get the World Cup trophy, right? But they also get this thing, especially for this tournament, for the winner, called the Coppa del Duce, the Duce Cup, which is this monstrous like thing that's 5 times larger than the World Cup trophies like this. The Coppa del Duce is like the size of me, and it's this grotesque thing with these like muscled Roman guys, etc. And then 4 years later in France, the Italian team does it again. They repeat. And arguably they repeat this time around because they're actually the 38 team was probably better than the 34 team. And right, they didn't need bribes and crooked officials to be, pulling games for them. And then right, World War II happens and, things go badly, right? Uh Italian football carries on a couple. There's still a national championship the first couple of years of the war, but by 1942 there is no football, and then right after 1945 there is no fascism, kind of. And it would seem like the fascist legacy in Italian football is dead. But here's the problem, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about Germany, I guess, because even though Germany still has a ways to go, the Germans, at least after World War II, had a reckoning about their past. In Italy, there's no reckoning. There are certain, Italian fascist officials that were going to be tried for war crimes, but that never happens. There is no Nuremberg trial for the Italians. Many of these war crimes occur in Africa, and so they're done against black people and Arabs. So the French and the British and the Americans don't decide to do this because if they're going to try Italians for war crimes against black people, then they're going to have to try themselves too. But also, too, remember, Italy, the last 3 years of World War II is an ideological civil war between homegrown fascists and homegrown anti-fascists. So a lot of these war crimes, hey, I think I can see my face again. Apologies about that. It's a weird day today. Uh, a lot of these crimes occur in Italy itself. Whole villages in northern Italy under the German occupation, where the Germans wouldn't allow the fascist Italians to fight the Americans and the British, but they said, if you want to kill your own population and fight the communists, go ahead and knock yourselves out. Entire villages in northern Italy are just wiped off the map, in these, mass reprisals, partisans, assassinated a fascist official or shot up some Germans. What the Germans would do is turn these, effectively homegrown fascist death squads onto the local population. Massacres happen and no one gets punished. No one is brought to jail. And the sick thing is because the Cold War starts almost instantaneously, unlike in Germany where it's illegal to be a Nazi, within 2 years after the war, fascist parties are running in Italian elections and winning 15, 20% of the vote. And Italy, there's no official justice, there's no reckoning about the fascist past. And there's kind of a collective amnesia. Like I've talked to Italians who are my friends, and some of them say crazy shit. Like they say, like, "Oh, well, it really was just Mussolini. Ordinary Italians were never on board with fascism." And I say, look, enough of them had to be because they stayed in power for a long time. And right during the war, there were enough Italians that even after Mussolini got deposed, stuck with the guy and did some really horrible things, and no one was held accountable. And they say crazy things like, "Oh, Italy didn't use poison gas in Ethiopia." Oh no, they did. I've actually read documents that explicitly say they did. Right. Or they didn't use concentration camps in Libya, and it wasn't really that bad. Mussolini, he didn't hate Jews, and yeah, wasn't like Hitler. There's this tendency in contemporary Italy to whitewash fascism and to say, oh, it really wasn't that bad. It wasn't as bad as Germany. Increasingly, thank God, historians, who this is our job, are challenging that myth, and that myth really doesn't hold up. Italian fascism at its worst was just as brutal, just as genocidal, just as racist as the Nazi variant. And maybe because the fact that most of its victims were not white is why we don't want to have that conversation. I want to have it. But Italy kind of doesn't. And this is why Italy's weird. Because fascism dies, kind of, in 1945 when Italian partisans take Mussolini, shoot him in the face, and string his body up at a gas station so people could throw bricks and tomatoes at him. But the larger conversation about the legacy of fascism, the crimes of fascism, and what the fascist period in Italian history meant pretty much stops after the war. And it never really happens. And I think that's why we live in a world today where the party that is the actual successor to Mussolini's fascist party is the leading coalition partner in the Italian government. So the spiritual heirs of Mussolini are ruling Italy once more. Why we see these incidents in Italian football, not all Italian fans, but a fair number of them, with banana peels being thrown at black players. And, there seems to be an incident of racial abuse almost weekly. And also why you have a club in the nation's capital that we refer to as Fascist Bozo FC. The legacy of fascism is still there, and it hasn't been talked about. It hasn't been addressed enough. There is no justice. There was no justice in 45. There is no historical justice now, although maybe we're starting to finally get there. And because of that void, fascism's legacy, especially in terms of football, a sport which it never really embraced, a sport that was always queasy about, a sport that it embraced because it had to embrace. Yeah, in a lot of ways it failed. Inter Milan is Inter Milan again. AS Roma, which is supposed to be your like, you know, showpiece. Their fans are anti-fascists. But if you know anything about Italian football, the kind of civil war that World War II became in Italy between fascists and anti-fascists, ranging from communists, socialists, trade unionists, to Catholic Democrats, to Catholic socialists. If you look at Italian football and you look at fan bases, that civil war is effectively still going on. Every time there's a Rome derby, that civil war is going on. Every time my other club in Italy, that's not Napoli, Lazio, plays freaking anybody, especially in the day when they were in Serie, they would play Fascist Bozo FC. That civil war is still going on. Yeah, things have changed. It's been a long time since the war, but maybe in a weird way, football is one of the two places in Italian culture. I'll talk about the other one in a second, where you can have like frank conversations about fascism and the legacy of fascism and the continuing conflicts within Italian society about fascism. Football and weirdly westerns, right? Because the Italians made all these westerns in the 60s and 70s that had fuck all to do with the United States. They were all set in the United States or they're set in Mexico, but those westerns weren't about America or Mexico. A lot of them were about, European or global political realities. A lot of them tend to be left wing. A lot of them tend to be anti-imperialist, but a lot of them tend to be about World War II, right? And or about Italy, right? Like when you see Mexican, read Sicilian. That's your people, Coach G. Right. A lot of them are about World War II. Like you see that in the Good, the Bad, the Ugly. That's not a prisoner of war camp, guys. That's a concentration camp. And in my favorite spaghetti western or Italian western, The Great Silence, which ends in a massacre of a village in the snow. And how many villages in northern Italy in the Alps were massacred by fascist death squads between 1943 and 1945. You couldn't talk about that in Italian politics, but you can make a movie about it and set it in the West in Utah and have Klaus Kinski as the fascist, which, by the way, good fucking casting. And you can have that conversation and I guess fight that fight because the fight's still going on in the terraces, Saturdays and Sundays. So the fascist legacy in Italian football, it's still there. It's the gorilla in the middle of the room that nobody wants to address. And even though the fascist footballing project failed, as indeed I guess the fascist project failed, again, kind of, because check out Italy's government at the moment. Its legacy is still unfortunately very much there. So, wow, yeah, I said this was going to be a long one, and apologies if all of a sudden my face becomes weird in this video. The lighting in my office got real shitty real quick, but now it seems to be okay. Uh, sure, Engineer Stead might be able to clear that up, I hope. Anyway, this is Professor Matt. This is the Too Many Guys Soccer Show, and this is the first, is episode one of our three-part series on fascism and football. Join me for our next episode, which hopefully will be out in sometime in the next 3 or 4 weeks, about football and the Third Reich. Peace it, my friends. If you haven't already, like, comment, subscribe, do the thing. До свидания. Arrivederci. Ciao.